The Origin of Taints in the Process of Dependent Origination by Venerable Rungruang Papassaro, Dr. Rungruang Limchoopatipa. Now let us investigate on how this delusional self arises and is escalated to become defilements inside the mind. The Buddha explained that there were three areas within the process of dependent origination that incurred defilements inside the mind by delusional self as follows. Starting at the craving, where is the origin of the assumption of either a self or anything belonging to a self. That is, dependence upon the contact of stimulus from the world and the mind, then recognizes either a self or anything belonging to a self. In these six bases for contact, arises mental feeling and craving, respectively. At the stage of craving, the mind is struggling with the existence of a self to absorb feeling, with either craving for sensual pleasure or craving for extermination. Since the prominent activities at craving are the struggling for sensual pleasure, therefore the taint for sensual pleasure is closely related to craving. And in order to destruct this kind of taint, the Buddha suggested to establish mindfulness with the proper dharma. For example, the knowledge of the reality of the world, so that the mind will be disenchanted and dispassionate to the world, and then the mind will be contained and not to be struggling with craving in the process of dependent origination. The domination of a self inside the mind processing at the five aggregates subject to clinging. That is, dependence upon craving, arises pursuit, gain, decision-making, and desire and lust, respectively. And then the mind is dominated by the recognition of either a self or anything belonging to a self to be the aggregates subject to clinging. At the stage of clinging, the mind is fully dominated by delusional self, and no matter whatsoever the mind will be in the five aggregates of being, form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness, the object of consciousness will be associated with a particular self. Therefore the taint for existence is closely related to clinging. And in order to destruct this kind of taint, the Buddha suggested to establish mindfulness with proper dharma. For example, the knowledge that everything and every phenomena are no self, so that the mind will disengage with the object of consciousness, and then release the burden of five aggregates subject to clinging in the process of dependent origination. Finally, the production of renewed object of consciousness at ignorance. That is, the aftershock of the aggregates subject to clinging with ignorance will cause the mind to reproduce the renewed object of consciousness to resume the flow of the process of dependent origination into the next round. At the stage of ignorance, the mind lacks the knowledge of the truths of life within nature, and resumes the renewal process of dependent origination. Therefore the taint for ignorance is closely related to ignorance. And in order to destruct this kind of taint, the Buddha suggested to establish mindfulness with proper dharma. For example, applying the Four Noble Truths to reveal the truths of nature, that consciousness is no self, so that the mind will gain the knowledge to stop the production and the establishing of consciousness in the renewal process of dependent origination. And then there are no continuances of consciousness and the object of consciousness. And once the process of dependent origination is terminated, then there will be no more escalation and the aggravation of defilements inside the mind processing. The Buddha explained that what one intends and what one plans and whatever that one has a tendency toward the process of dependent origination with delusional self. This delusional self becomes a basis for the continuance of consciousness, as stream of consciousness. And when there is a basis, there is a support for the establishing of consciousness with defilement. And when consciousness with defilement is established and has come to growth, there are the productions of future renewed existence of new consciousness and the object of consciousness. And when there is the production of future renewed existence, future birth, aging and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair come to be. Such is the origin of this whole mass of suffering. Clearly, the core knowledge of the Buddha discovery is that fact that the state of mind, as the reflection of emitted neurotransmitter, is just a part of nature, so-called element in nature or nature, and it is no self. And the mind, as revealed to be a natural process of signal processing in the recent study in human connectome, these mental phenomena are natural process, and they are no self. Therefore, life which consists of a stream of consciousness is obviously no self as well. However, due to the strong belief that there must be a self to absorb a feeling to be, I feel it. This is my feeling. The feeling is happening in me. then this existence of self is fully dominated throughout the mind processing with desire and lust to become the five aggregates subject to clinging. The Buddha explained that dependence upon the contact of stimuli and receptor organs at the sixth sense basis arose a feeling, and this kind of feeling was called a bodily feeling. However, due to the assumption of self in the five aggregates subject to clinging, the mind internally produced an internal mental object of consciousness of which when the mind made contact with, then arose a mental feeling. The bodily feeling was real because there was a real stimulus from the world, but the mental feeling was an imagination because it was the production of internal mind processing associated with the existence of self. The bodily feeling was the initial response to the world, while the mental feeling was sort of mental response to the internal world of imagination. The Buddha explained that by establishing mindfulness to see what was happening in insight observation, particularly at feeling, then we would be able to distinguish between the reality of the world from the internal imagination. And in this circumstance a noble person should abandon the arising mental feeling, and as a result the noble person would have only the bodily feeling, but not the mental feeling. And specifically the destruction of the taints must be taken at these three areas of craving, clinging, and ignorance in order to completely terminate the process of dependent origination. Realizing the fact that life is just a natural process which is no self, then by establishing mindfulness with this knowledge, Dharma, to disrupt the flow of the signal processing at the craving, and the clinging and the production of the renewed object of consciousness at the ignorance of the process of dependent origination. Then there will be no continuance of consciousness and the object of consciousness to feed in the mind processing anymore. The noble person does not recognize either a self or anything belonging to a self. Since he does not recognize anything thus, he does not cling to anything in the world. Not clinging, he is not agitated. Destroyed is birth. The spiritual life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more coming back to any state of being. This is the true knowledge from the Buddha enlightenment to make an end of suffering in life, and after then the life will reach the unborn supreme security from bondage, nibbana.